My name is Brian McTeer. I want to go through our basic busing and routing when we mix a song for Shaking Through. It really helps when you're mixing to have, I think, a very pronounced theory of operation going into it. It's very important to make a definitive change in mindset to mixing. From my experience, it's a terrible idea to try to record and mix in the same day. Because all these sounds that you're trying to capture to sound as huge as they can, you can't really bring yourself to chop them down into smaller sizes and quantities because you're so in love with like the microphone you used, or you're so in love with the preamp that you used, you know? So that's what we're doing here. That's what this is. We're thinking very heavily, very strongly in advance of where things go, what happens to them as they go along, and where we want them to end up in the end. So our basic principle is, you know, we're going to automate our mix in Pro Tools. We're going to send 10 buses out of Pro Tools directly to the faders on the console. The left and right output of the console is going to go through a passive stereo EQ and 2 compressors. That'll be in while we're working. And then as far as the individual tracks in Pro Tools, we use a few plugins, but for the most part, for the really important things, we're using the inserts in Pro Tools to access our outboard gear. We spent the whole day tracking yesterday. So we were using a different I/O, and we have things patched differently. We have a lot of things patched into preamps. So the first thing I'm gonna do is just break everything down, start from a clean slate. Just like I cleared out the patch bay, I'm gonna clear out all the I/O. I'm gonna import our mix I/O, which basically has, you know, all of the appropriate inputs and outputs for mixing. We have 4 mono outputs to the console and 3 stereo outputs. This is to make it so that the outputs of Pro Tools sum in the console. The 4 monos are kick, snare, bass, and vocal. And then the 3 stereo are drums, guitar, and stereo vocals. With each one of these buses out of Pro Tools that goes to the console, we've done some sort of predetermined shaping of the signals going out. It's basically sort of predefining the maximum size and shape of anything that comes out of the kick channel. And we have similar predetermined shape constrictions basically for all of them. You know, that's the snare, that's the bass. The reason is because in order to get everything to blend, these instruments do fit together as an ensemble. It doesn't really behoove anybody to have more low end in your guitars than you need to, because that ends up taking away space from the low end that the bass can carry. When you go through and you really logically think about what each of these bus outputs should be restricted to, you start making room for all the other corresponding bus outputs in all those places. We then calibrated the stereo output of the console to go through this chain of outboard processors for the 2 mix. So the Manley, the Day King FET2 compressor, and this Serpent Audio stereo compressor. So that's it for the calibration. Now I do need to patch in all my I/O. Now everything is routed out of Pro Tools, through the bus outputs in Pro Tools, through the console. It behooves anybody to establish a theory of operation specifically for mixing, whatever it is. This is ours, and anybody else can have theirs, but it should be very different from tracking. It's somewhat of a ritual, for sure, and I think that that's actually made our mixes better. The thinking that goes into mixing is half aesthetic and half scientific. And that scientific part is extremely important and extremely overlooked.